Welcome to the Nick Halaris Show. This is the place where we explore big ideas with people having a big impact on our world. I'm your host, Nick Halaris, serial entrepreneur, author, early morning riser, and seeker of truth and wisdom. Join me as we explore the journeys and discoveries of fascinating people who are literally unlocking the secrets to creating a life of both success and fulfillment. Each episode will arm you with insights, ideas, and practical perspectives on what it takes not only to be financially and personally successful, but also how to start having authentic impact on the world around you. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Nick Halaris Show. This week, we have a familiar face, my good friend, John Njoku, who has been on the show 2 times already, so this is number 3. And we figured it was time for him to make an appearance again and review some of the stuff that we've been talking about here on the show and writing about in the newsletter. So, John, welcome back, and thanks for being here.
Hey, it's always a pleasure to jam with you on all these crazy ideas and a lot of really fascinating guests and some great content on the newsletter. Thanks again for having me. Look, the first thing I think we need to review is your workout this morning, because I know that every time that I've gotten on the pod, we've talked about that, and I think we should continue doing that.
Yeah, look, I'm happy to indulge. I know it's like it's an interesting topic for you because it's hard to wrap your mind around someone who's actually pushes themselves. And
I struggle with it. I do.
It goes for it. Today, though, honestly, it's good. It's a good day to actually answer that question because, again, we did a workout today that a huge percentage of the global population could not complete.
Go on then. You have my attention.
Yeah. So. We're in the middle of a strength cycle. So the first part of the class was like front squats, wave sets. So wave sets are where you you do 3 waves, 6 reps, 4, 2, and then you do another wave and you increase the weight. And so we started off, I actually partnered with a friend of mine, and we started off at 155 and ended at 195 on front squats. For front squats, yeah.
That's tough.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's, again, that's not some of the best, the most strongest guys in the gym can do a lot more than that. But 195 is a respectable front squat. But the workout was the hard part. So the workout was a 500 meter buy-in on the rower, and then 4 rounds of 10 pull-ups and 20 reverse lunges with 95-pound barbell. So it's literally, if you think about it, it's 40 pull-ups and 80 reverse lunges with 95 pounds on your back. And that was tough.
I'm not in your CrossFit cult, so there's some of the nomenclature that I don't really know. So what's a buy-in?
So you just basically, before you're allowed to start the 4 rounds, you have to do 500 meters on the row. It's basically just to get you going.
That's adorable. That's adorable. So look, man, there's so much going on. I don't even know where to begin because, one thing that I feel like you could make a podcast of just riffing on current events alone. And then, of course, you have all of your dope content. One of the things that struck me was you made this transition from going deep on finance in the summer to just more of the leadership trajectory, some of which has been super, super interesting. So was there any method to the madness in that transition? Was there some current events with the economy and stuff like that you were let's nail that over the summer, and then now let's focus on leadership, and maybe there's a civic component with the election cycle starting up again? Was there any method to the madness there, or not really?
Not really. I'm trying to be intentional about the guests, and at the very beginning, it was more about who's interesting that would actually respond to my emails and stuff. And so I had all these contacts in the finance world because that's how I got started in this game. But now actually we're starting to become a lot easier to find guests. And we actually had yesterday the first person reach out to us cold and say, "Hey, we want to come on your show," which is kind of interesting. A cool milestone. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It is cool to see it grow. One of the other things, and we talked a lot about this offline because you were off the radar. You went on vacation with the fam to Mexico, and that begot some interesting content around socially conscious capitalism and timeshare. And maybe You told me a little bit of this story. You wrote about it in one of the newsletters, but unpack that story. What was going on in the timeshare, and even share some of like, because you were saying like the resort was interesting in so many ways, but it was also like a little bit much for you. So what was going through your head, and relay that story, if you will.
Yeah, sure. So we went to Cabo and we stayed at one of these. I won't name the brand because I think that all the brands that are engaging in this behavior are doing the same thing. So it's unfair to pick on them. But it was in one of these places where it's like all in one, all inclusive, family friendly
Yeah,
kind
your
of place.
wristbands.
Yeah, exactly. Which was a very annoying. I didn't really enjoy like having to wear a wristband for 4 days, but whatever. And what really got me thinking, I've been thinking a lot about socially conscious capitalism for a long time, reading books about it and whatnot. But when I was there, something happened that really got me thinking about it, which is like the moment you get there, they pull you aside, they pull your group aside, and they're like, "Oh, if two of you will come on the timeshare tour tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Like we'll get you free massages. We'll get
Oh
you
yeah,
over
the
free
gifts.
massages." Yeah.
You guys were marks.
Yeah, exactly. So one of the families in our group, we actually had 4 families with, they like said, you know what? Everyone needs a free massage. So we'll just do it. The process, like the whole thing was just absolutely like ridiculous in a sense. Like they had to go at 8 o'clock. It was told it was going to be an hour, ends up being like several hours.
On site though, at least it was
On
it was
site,
on the
yeah.
resort. Okay, fine.
Yeah, and like the description that they came back with, and I saw some of it because the breakfast portion of it was in sort of the common area. So I saw them,
So
people
you could see them
serving champagne and like all this stuff. But at the end of the day, like what these companies are trying to do is get people who are like on their first day of vacation or maybe, maybe their second day and having fun, get them drinking alcohol in the morning, thinking they're getting something for free, and then trying to sell them what amounts to like an incredibly consequential financial product using debt and not inexpensive debt. And the sales tactics like are kind of like ingeniously devised to copy like car sales tactics and like using like social pressure. Like you don't want to seem like you don't have any money amidst this group of strangers that you're in. And then they take you through the whole journey. Like they get you a little buzzed, they sell you this dream, and then they peel you off into like individual groups and they try to close you. It's messed up, and it got me thinking about like, man, there's a lot of circumstances in our economy where the sales practices are not really, ideal in any way, or maybe not even moral. Like for example, like I question whether that practice in and of itself is moral, but there are other ones that are more obvious. Like we used to have advertisements for cigarettes and stuff. Like obviously, not necessarily the best thing for people to get them addicted to nicotine. Yeah.
It sounded like that. I mean, you're obviously thinking about this stuff all the time, but it sounded like that was like a catalyst to, or just a real live example of like where you think some of the ills of our system now. I mean, do you think I had that right?
Yeah, I think so. Like, look, there's nothing wrong with a timeshare. That it's not like that particular product shouldn't exist in the economy.
Well, you can't
Because
get rid of them once you have them. So maybe
yeah,
there's that, but that's a whole other discussion.
yeah. What I find problematic about it is selling complicated financial products to people in that way. Because look, we know that like financial literacy is a global problem, and serving alcohol and getting people to sign up for what amounts to like a 20-year commitment, like to effectively use that. It's like a $200,000 contract or something. So to effectively use it, you're talking about like 20 years of vacations. And so I feel like there should be like a cooling off period or some kind of, I don't know how you fix that, but it's definitely problematic. People should be careful of that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting. I mean, there's two things that are ringing in my head when you're mentioning that. One is you brought up financial literacy is a theme, I think, in your life. I mean, generally, you brought up when you were talking to Darius about you were teaching in a charter school. So, this is something that you're very big on as well. And obviously it sounds like he is, but you said that you don't think that a lot of our leaders in our democracy have that financial literacy or feel like that's an essential component of engagement. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two levels of financial literacy, as you mentioned. There's sort of the household level, which is, do you have the understanding of the financial world to make intelligent decisions on behalf of your household? How do you structure your life? What kind of contracts do you agree to? Like, how do you purchase your cars, your house, that kind of thing? So what kind of investments do you make? There's that. And that we know, like, I don't have the data at the top of my head, but we know that there is a massive financial literacy problem globally. Like, most people don't understand like basics about interest and how compound interest works and how even like a standard 30-year mortgage product here in the United States, for example. So that's a problem. But putting that aside, what I've been talking about a lot on the podcast and in the newsletter as well is there's another level of financial literacy that is maybe more important because we're talking about people with immense power. And what I mean by that is our system is so complex financially, and it requires like several years of study, after a strong foundation of liberal arts education to even have a chance of understanding it. And what I've seen just from the interactions I've had and the speeches and the decisions that we see being made at the highest levels of our government suggest to me that there's a serious lack of understanding of how the financial system is working. And it's problematic because if you don't understand it, you can't really make decisions. You can't even think about what's the long-term best interest of the country if you don't understand some of these financial issues.
Do you have like one or two examples of that?
Yeah, like I'll give you a real live example. Like if you rewind the clock to the COVID days, the interest rates in America were pinned to the floor by the Fed as an attempt to sort of stimulate the economy in the face of the pandemic. And at the same time, the government was making decisions that were going to produce huge fiscal deficits. They had this opportunity, in my view, to, if they thought about it strategically, they could have said, well, why don't we think strategically about the term structure of this debt that we're issuing so that if there are consequences, like there usually is consequences for whenever you spend money and print money, like inflation, that we don't run into a situation where we have really high interest rates and we have to refinance a bunch of debt. And so the Treasury Department, which is like run by Janet Yellen, a former chair of the Federal Reserve, in my view, should have been like, hey, let's issue a bunch of at least 30 years, if not more. Let's issue a bunch of long-term debt while the rates are low. And if the Fed is going to buy this stuff anyways, what's the difference? It's not like we're selling it to the public. I mean, they were selling it to the public, but ultimately, like the Fed was the buyer of last resort. So they could have pulled this off and they could have saved what is going to be a crisis in the American balance sheet in the next few years. Like the fiscal deficit is running out of control. Interest rates are killing it. And it's going to present a real problem. And the government's going to be in this impossible position where they have to choose between honoring the interest payments and honoring all the promises they've made through Medicare and Social Security and blah, 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 right? Because it eventually is going to be too big of a hole. So that's a good example of, holy crap, like that's some basic finance 101. Like if you were running a corporation and you had the chance, like the smart corporations, by the way, in that period, they all took out long-term debt at as low a rate as possible because it was free money essentially. But the U.S. government's over here like issuing like 1 and 2 and 5-year treasuries instead of a bunch of 30 years or more. It makes no sense.
I mean, but we've been hearing about this hole too big that we can't climb out of our whole lives. Are you saying that at some point, very in the short term, near term, we're finally going to not be able to climb out of it and going to have to make some really complicated decisions?
Yeah, like that's a great question. And it's one actually I explored on the podcast with several of the finance guests. And it's hard to say, like, look, we had a balanced budget 20 something years ago, and we had when President George W. Bush took over, like there was a runway to paying off the debt. Like we had gotten ourselves in a really interesting position, right? And I don't know if you remember back in the presidential debates, it was the sort of first presidential debate that I paid close attention to with Gore. And
absolutely not. I was in college, high school somewhere. I was not paying any kind of attention to that. Shows what kind of college experience you had, you big nerd.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But they were going back and forth with like what to do with the surplus. Like Gore wanted to create a lockbox and save the money for Social Security, which if you look at the forecast of Social Security and Medicare, they look like they're going to go runaway on us eventually in terms of the cost. So there's this huge debate. So I forget what the debt was at the time. It was I might be wrong about this, but it was in the low trillions. And it's like 33 trillion as we sit here today and growing fast, growing at a rate of like a couple trillion a year now with the new interest rate costs and then all of these sort of stimulus programs that the last couple presidents have put in place. And so it's hard to say exactly when, but because there's like contemporary examples where the debt to GDP ratio has gotten crazy. Like I think Japan's over 350%, something like that. America is still in the solid, like just over 100%. I think it's like 130, 140%. So it's hard to say exactly when that debt problem will break the system, but it will. It'll either be passed along to the American population in the form of inflation, or there'll be some kind of a default.
One of the things with some of these, like we'll call them Tuesday morning quarterbackings of what we should have done during COVID, is that most of the world is like, this is a global thing. Like most of the world is still reeling from some of the financial and otherwise, other decisions made from a policy standpoint. Like most of the world is still unwinding from that. And that's something that I think it was Simon, you guys were talking about, globalization and how some of the geopolitical unrest is unwinding some of that. Do you look at some of the decisions that the US made during COVID in a vacuum, in that like, okay, well, we could have done this, but because we didn't, we're going to have to deal with it, versus like other countries around the world that are basically, our interest rate decisions are, we're looking to other countries, seeing what they're doing because they're in the same bucket too. It was a global phenomenon. So I don't know, like, do you think of some of the US decisions in a vacuum versus like the rest of the world, or unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, I think you do need to keep in mind, like when you're evaluating these things, the relative position of this country. For example, the U.S. is still the strongest country in the world, has the most dynamic economy, has the biggest military, and so you can't, to understand what's happening, you can't really ignore that, and you can't ignore the positions of other countries as well. I think what Simon was concerned about was that, he's been a long time bear, at least for a decade. And it's a result of his experiences on Wall Street during the global financial crisis. And
he has a company that has gold bricks, right? So that's, that's as bearish as we get, or yeah.
Yeah. Like basically Simon's story is fascinating because after making a bunch of money in the global financial crisis, essentially betting against the market and against credit instruments in particular, what he saw scared him so much. He was like, holy crap, this is a giant house of cards. And the government response to it made him think that it's actually gotten even worse. So like maybe we staved off a Great Depression redux, but we've created even more systemic problems in the financial system. And his solution was like, what would I want to own if the financial system were to look like 2008 again, but with significantly more leverage? And he came to the conclusion that gold is basically the only thing that you really want to own, because It can be a non-financial asset, but the only way to own gold non-financially is to actually own the physical gold. But the problem with owning physical gold is that it's expensive because you've got to protect it, right? So you need like a vault. And so he created this company where there's a bunch of vaults around the world in several different jurisdictions. But I think there actually is like a flaw with Simon's business model, and I think his thesis is probably right that like when this thing falls apart, you do want to own gold. And my concern with Simon's business model is that let's assume that he's right, that there's a crisis that literally blows up the financial system in a manner in which the governments cannot save it. And so asset prices go to zero, all the banks fail, like it starts to feel like the 1930s. The likely scenario politically would make it really hard for you to just assume that you could go like extract your gold from one of his vaults. Like, what's to say that there aren't like mobs who've already taken that, who've already stormed the vault and taken all the gold and whatnot? Like, it's hard to imagine.
What do you mean by that? You said politically. What do you mean? Like, tie that in. What do you mean?
Dude, if everybody's money went away, like what's going to happen? People will be in the streets rioting. Like, who knows what's going to happen? We haven't really even seen it. Like the Great Depression never got as bad as what Simon is sort of forecasting, where it's just vaporized, where wealth is vaporized. And in a world where financial wealth gets vaporized, there will be so much unrest. It'll be so chaotic. It'll feel like the zombie apocalypse type scenario. That's my view. That's why I think the vaulting of gold, unless you vault it in your own sort of protected mansion or something, like I don't know if it actually helps you.
Did you broach Bitcoin with Simon? I don't recall hearing that. I don't know if you guys talked either during that or offline or what.
Yeah. Let me think about it. I don't think we talked about it in the episode, but I did talk to him before about it. And he had a good perspective. It's one that I think people should really think about, which is that Bitcoin is a weird phenomenon financially because it is an asset with an unknown origin. Like essentially, if you go back in time,
Satoshi invented it. Come on.
Yeah, some magical person who, by the way, is like the richest person on planet Earth. If it was a person, if it was just one person.
Right.
Or maybe it's a group of people. Like if just on that, like holy crap, they're among the elite, wealthy individuals ever in human history. And so his view is like pretty bearish. Essentially, it's like one day it just goes to zero because what are we talking about here? We're talking about some mysterious thing. Like, are you really going to store your life savings in Bitcoin? I think it's a good point.
Yeah. So I think Simon's episode is an interesting segue to the current event, Pink Elephant. If I understand one of the points he was trying to make, which I loved, is that the current geopolitical environment is almost like the antithesis of the globalization movement. And, what interrupts the U.S. hegemony is just conflict and maybe the Russia-China alliance, maybe seeing what the Saudis are doing in the Middle East. And so I guess there's so many opinions running around and stuff like that, and even understanding the facts in the Israel, that kind of recurring conflict. But one thing that I'm fascinated with, you mentioned, I think it was to Dimitri in another episode, the Hidden Forces founder, that the U.S. has an obligation to kind of arbit the world a little bit. And so I'm just curious whether you have any revised thoughts around the U.S.'s kind of unwavering allyship to Israel and kind of our involvement in the Middle East amidst this new conflict. New, in quotes.
Yeah, well, first of all, what's going on in Israel today is like an absolute human tragedy. And it
For sure.
It's a reminder that security is a great illusion. You just never know. You never know. There are people who are willing to engage in evil acts, and you can try to protect yourself against it. But if someone is willing to do that, you're going to have to be ready to deal with it, and it's terrible. So put that aside. I really believe that America has a special obligation to the world. Yeah. And if you rewind the clock, like America is a very unique nation. And it's a nation in history that is not without its own demons, right? We have engaged in very questionable behavior in our history. And even to this day, we
Still do. Yeah, of
still do.
course.
However, it's also been a great defender of freedom and remains so, and remains the only country on earth that could actually defend freedom in the world against the forces of evil, like Hamas, for example. Like if there was enough people, I think Hamas is a group that's going to end relatively soon as a result of this conflict. But anyways, America is the only game in town when it comes to freedom, and we have this obligation. And if you rewind the clock to the end of World War II, for example, there's no nation in history that had the kind of power that we had at that moment in time that wouldn't have just taken the whole world over. We had this massive military machine. We had unbelievable manufacturing production capabilities. We had just decimated several world powers and had our armies all over the world. And we had this nuclear advantage. And we stepped back and we let peace come upon earth, and we let the Soviets take over large parts of the world that we went to war to make free from the Nazis. So we sort of made this like decision. In my view, it was a mistake ultimately, because we allowed an empire at the moment in time that was just as evil as the Nazis. We allowed them to take over Poland, for example, which the whole thing started over the Nazi invasion of Poland. But anyways, America is unlike any other country. The Romans in 1945, they would have taken over the entire world. Anyone who didn't submit to them, they would have just nuked. And the Americans we have this like special quality about us where we're magnanimous in victory. And again, America is not some angel. We got our own problems, and we have our own history and own questionable behavior. But judged on that scale, like, man, you don't want to lose to anybody but America. If you're another country, that's the country in history that you want to lose a war to, because America is not going to like kill everybody in your country and take you over. They're going to like give you a bunch of money, bring you into the empire, rebuild your infrastructure, make you a long-term ally, like we did with Germany and Japan. And so that's a kind of unique thing. And I think it's born out of our culture where we do believe as a society in these principles of freedom and justice. Hey guys, this is Nick. I wanted to take a quick break from the episode to share some exciting news. In addition to the podcast, I want to make you aware of some additional content we're putting out. And best of all, it's 100% free. Our Profit Plus newsletter consists of weekly insights about what it takes to find meaning in the pursuit of modern success. This is the place where we explore big ideas at the intersection of markets, business, politics, and life, as we seek to empower our readers to have an authentic impact on the world. If you're serious about finding fulfillment amid success, then definitely check out these additional insights. Just go to subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's subscribe.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
Do you think, that's a very strong statement, and it's a testament to your patriotic beliefs, and good for you. I wish I was there with you. But how do you define freedom? Like, do you think that America's definition of freedom is the same definition that everyone has around the world? And I'll just say, like, so we watch the news, and I think it's very clear, like, the U.S. we're allies with Israel. It's also clear that the atrocities that Hamas has committed, deplorable, reprehensible in every way. And then kind of stinks that Israel's going back and they're going to, literally destroy Hamas, and almost at all costs, right? There's going to be some civilian casualties, and that's going to be unfortunate as well. And that is unfortunate in the same way. One thing that just strikes me is like the battle cry, the rallying cry around the Palestinian movement is to free Palestine. And so you're saying that America is pro-freedom, but these guys on the other side of it are saying free Palestine. Is there a way to square that at all? Because they have their own, and that's some of the things that, as you live around the world and go see, like, everyone has their own perspective. of what things happen. Do you believe that there does have to be like a dominant country? And you've mentioned that, or how do you square like free Palestine and America's version of freedom? It's very interesting.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think freedom works on many levels. So you have national freedom, which is sort of the right to self-determination, which is the core foundation of America, for example. You have political freedom within a nation, which is, do you have the right to vote, which we had our own battle here in this country along racial lines and along gender as well, which is important. And then you have economic freedom, which is also important. And then you have, I guess, what we've been fighting about in America, I guess, for the last 30 years is like personal freedom. Like, what can I choose to do to myself or not, and without the government being involved? So the freedom's working on like all these different levels. And I think when it comes to the Israeli-Palestine situation, just a full disclaimer for the audience, I'm no expert on this, but I do believe that America in the post-World War II era has failed in its role as the global power, the global leader, in allowing that situation to not get resolved. And so we've had presidents over the years attempt to intervene in that region and reach some kind of solution, but we haven't seen it through. Obviously, there's still an issue there, and it's one of the biggest problems, unsolved problems in the geopolitical landscape is what's happening in that area. And I feel like this moment in time is another stark reminder that America and other allies, European allies, and the whole world needs to come together to try to figure out how to create an environment so there could be lasting peace in that region. And I don't have the exact answer to it, but that's what needs to be focused. Yeah.
To your point, there's a lack of a diplomatic presence in that part of the world, and there's Senator Tuberville's I guess blockade, for lack of a better word, of things kind of moving forward. So you're right, like, and I think it's tough to, if you're just you're seeing a layperson and you're just seeing all this information whiz bang, and then Twitter's no help these days, of course, and it's tough to like string things together and get a cohesive narrative. But yeah, I mean, I think it's a clear line between a diplomatic presence in that part of the world and then, a commitment to a peaceful process and trying, who's even there to broker that. And right now, it's no one that is in a position to. It's interesting, and I guess you'd have the same thoughts around like in Ukraine and Russia, like same kind of deal. I guess they're parallel on some level, in that there's conflict and U.S. is kind of saying, hey, these people, we're with these guys and we're going to support them, not directly, but indirectly, and so on.
Yeah, like Ukraine is a slightly different situation, because this is where you have, instead of like straight up terrorist attack, which is what's happening in Israel today, you have a nation state attempting to be aggressive, territorially aggressive, which we haven't seen really in a long time, right? The last power to be territorially aggressive was the Nazis, and then we know how that ended, right?
By the way, I mean, people would say that they're totally parallel, because you'd say, well, we'll brand Hamas and the UN branded Hamas, and other people say, well, they're the actual leadership of Palestine. So, terrorist, not terrorist, nation state, not nation state. I just wanted to point out that I think that would be, I don't know, a fair quibble with the point, but go on.
Yeah, I feel like, again, I'm not an expert, but I feel like Hamas is, as bad as Putin is, Hamas is worse. Hamas has these like ridiculously stated claims, and have demonstrated a willingness to engage in straight up acts of terror. Like, you could argue that Putin's invasion of Ukraine was an act of terror, and there have been terror-like incidents where they're like blowing up apartment buildings and stuff, but it's of a slightly different character than the what Hamas did last weekend.
Sure. Yeah. Understood. And I think that's like the latest political jousting. It's like, man, how long are we going to continue to support all this stuff? But it sounds like, from what you're saying, it is what it is. Like that's our role. That's part of what comes with this, representing this democracy and trying to promote it nationwide or globally rather, is to stick with these crises.
Yeah, like America has since the big war, has been a reluctant superpower, and there are good things about it. Like I mentioned earlier, like the magnanimous victor and the rebuilding of Germany and Japan in the post World War II. That's a really unique historical moment, and the genius of the leadership at the time, like Marshall, who's one of the greatest Americans. But the reluctance to be a superpower has led America down some bad paths as well. And so this Israeli situation is one of them. I'm not sure the Ukraine one is. I feel like there's not much America really could or should have done differently with Ukraine and Russia. Because I feel like that this is like a mad dictator. Just, I don't exactly know what's going on there.
Flexing.
Flexing.
Yeah.
But yeah, like America should, if they were like the Romans, they simply wouldn't have allowed these situations to fester. And they would have used their military. The Romans would have used the military power and the economic power to establish an order around the world. And anyone who didn't toe the line would have been dealt with in a very brutal fashion. Like, I'm not advocating for this. I'm just saying what they would have done.
The next question.
The Romans, just knowing their history, like anyone who messed with them, they have several examples in their history where they just wiped people off the face of the earth. Like if you kept messing with them for a long enough time, they'll kill everybody in your civilization. And obviously that's evil and that's wrong, but it allowed them to establish a relatively peaceful empire for, arguably 1,000 years or so,
but it eventually fell.
Yeah, for sure. It was corrupt, and it's hard to judge their decisions. But America needs to, in my view, like going forward, like let's put the past aside. We can't do anything about the past. I feel like our generation, the generation that's sort of coming to power after this presidential election, where we still have 80-year-olds, but after that, our generation is going to come to power, and we need to be focused on establishing an American presence and an American moral authority around the world. We have that opportunity and, in my view, sort of moral obligation, because the technologies that we're developing are so potentially anti-freedom that America has to be number one. And we have to be willing to protect freedom around the world where we can and prevent the forces of evil from taking over and subjugating peoples. And
yeah, you bring up you brought up 80-year-olds running for office. I don't know how much of the Republican debates you've checked out. Obviously, it seems like Biden, Harris, foregone conclusion on the Democratic side. You got RFK now on the Indy ticket, apparently, and Cornel West switching sides. So there's that stuff. But the Republican, I guess it's more entertaining than anything else at this point. But any interesting threats or challenges to Trump? Is Trump his biggest challenger himself, like with all the stuff he's going through? Any novel thoughts on that? And with regard, because the Ukraine and all these geopolitical issues are salient now with regard to that crew running for the Republican side.
Yeah. It seems like, I can't believe it, but it seems like Trump is just going to run away with the nomination. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense to me.
Doing much, but like participating in debates and all that good stuff.
Yeah, it shows you sort of where the country's mindset is. And then, I think, in my view, I got to believe the biggest risk of this election is that something happens to President Biden. Like, I don't know, I'm not an insider to his administration, but it appears that he's aging. That job is a tough job. Even the young presidents, like Obama or Clinton, they come out of it with like a lot of gray hair. They come, it's a hard job. Yeah. And he's very old. Let's face it. So
not much older than Trump, though. Like he's 2 years on Trump, something crazy like that.
Yeah, from just on age alone, neither one of them should be president. And you could argue, maybe on cognitive ability, neither one of them should be president either. And on moral grounds, that Trump shouldn't be president. He's got a lot of problems, but
there's a lot. Do you think that means Vivek Ramaswamy is going to be? propel to the his youth and dynamism should vault him to somewhere higher?
I don't think so. No, I think he's a joke. Honestly, I don't think he has a
Go
chance.
on.
Yeah,
Interesting.
yeah.
You think he's a joke? Why do you think he's a joke?
I think look. I'm not following him that closely, but he basically is just parroting Trump's ideas, right? Like he's not really. Is he offering a vision for America that's really that different from Trump? I don't think so. It's like a divisive vision of what America is, and it's the us against them mentality, and it doesn't seem compelling to me.
It goes to show you that I think in that arena, if you're a little bit dynamic and charismatic, it can carry you a lot of the way. To be honest, I mean, he hasn't done a lot, and he's in terms of substantive things, great performance at the debates, all things considered. And all right, now he's a guy, and obviously he's been doing whatever he's done to get in this position. But it's just funny to see like all of a sudden this guy, and I think it's just because everyone else is just so kind of in this old political character playing, right, of just being presidential and whatever, and he's like actually dynamic and entertaining and quipping, and I guess that's what the youth want to see these days. People want to see for entertainment value.
Yeah, it's gonna be crazy. The risk is if something did happen to Biden, if he withdrew from the race or he had to withdraw from the race for health reasons or something, it makes it even crazier. I mean, it's going to be crazy as is. Like, imagine, I don't even know if they'll debate, but imagine the Trump and Biden debate 6 months from now. Can't even imagine the commentary that's going to come from those two. It'd be interesting.
I have another. We're cutting close on time here, but I have like 3 things, and maybe this goes into a King H thing. But you see the first thing is this border and migrant crisis. I have a hard time understanding whether things are getting worse or whether it just happens to be the issue du jour that the media and maybe social media, Elon Musk was there, that's what they're trying to serve up at this point in time. One thing is that my folks are from Chicago, and, it's visible over there. And so whatever the strategy was to get migrants out of the border areas and into America, it's working on some level in that it's more visible everywhere. But what's your take on that issue? How important is it now? I know that you have this I love this idea that you've had to just weaponize immigration, but I'm curious to see whether you have any novel thoughts in light of like some of the latest and greatest stuff in New York and Chicago and other big cities going on.
Yeah, it's a very important subject for the future of our country. And actually one of our guests, Isaac Saul from Tangle, he's been writing about this regularly in his newsletter. And the data that he cites suggests that the problem is actually getting worse. Like, I forget the exact numbers, but this is like order of magnitude about, I'm not even sure how they measure this, but it sounds like it's like a measure of the number of contacts that border law enforcement have with migrants in a given time period.
Oh, okay. All right.
And it was like in the low 1 millions in 2019. It had a lull during COVID. Now, I think in 2021, it was like 1.2, and now it's on pace to be like over 2 million for the year. And so that data suggests that the problem is actually getting worse in the last few years in terms of people trying to cross into the United States illegally. And my thoughts are, this is a function of sort of failed policy here at home and failed regional geopolitical policy with respect to our neighbors. Obviously, like we live in a place where like America still presents as like a way better life option than our nearest neighbors into the South in particular. And all this nonsense about the wall and whether we should build a wall, like, I think that's pretty dumb. But what we could do,
to build it, or the nonsense, the kind of politicization of a wall at all.
Both. Yeah, okay. They shouldn't waste their time and money on that. Like, it's really dumb.
Okay, all right.
Historically speaking, like walled strategies to deal with migration have failed. So you just have to look at a few examples. The Romans tried it, failed. The Chinese tried it, failed. So you don't have to be a genius historian to see that it's not a great strategy. But the migration point, I'm going to write a Prophet article about this because there's a famous British historian named Toynbee. I think I'm saying that name right. And his book is unreadable essentially, but I've tried to read it like 5 times in my life. He's such a genius that it's actually hard to follow. But he has a core thesis, which is that migration is the engine of history. And so he goes through all of these examples essentially of how great historical moments are driven by the migration of dissatisfied populations. And so we're in that right now, right? Like people are leaving the Middle East and pursuing life elsewhere in Europe. And then here in our side of the world, lots and lots of people are trying to get into America for various reasons. America, in my view, should invest a bunch of resources in the legal and administrative infrastructure to deal with migration rather than build a wall. Like my understanding of what's happening is that like asylum seekers, for example, like there's not enough judges and lawyers to deal with the cases. So there's this huge backlog and then nothing ever happens. And people sit in these unideal situations for months and months waiting to hear whether their asylum application has been heard. So the smart policy decision is, hey, why don't we throw some money at that? Let's triple the number of judges we have hearing those cases or whatever.
You've heard about this app?
No, I haven't heard about it. No.
No, I'm kind of joking, but there is an app, and I think that is their administrative achievement to like log on and get in line. So, but I hear your point, and I think it's a really solid one in that let's dedicate resources here instead of this kind of trophy thing that's symbolic of whatever, and let's just actually deal with the problem.
Yeah. And the other point about the wall and the whole strategy is Americans just need to get comfortable with immigration again. This country was based upon immigration, and immigration is not some evil force. People aren't coming to take your job away. Like we need to keep growing our population, and there are vital peoples around the world, not just asylum seekers, but just people who want to come here and try to build a life, that we should figure out a way to welcome them with open arms and make them a part of the legal infrastructure of America. It's more taxpayers, it's more economic resources, it's more talent. I mean, I don't really think there's a downside to immigration unless you're like letting a bunch of terrorists into the country or something like that. Like that's the downside, but let's just put in place the infrastructure to prevent that from happening.
I think I love that. I do think that just thinking aloud, riffing aloud, I think that one of the downsides is that it's visible. And so it's visible in a way that homelessness, unhoused, whatever is the kindest way of labeling that issue today is. So, when you're coming to the country in a legal process, you got to represent that you have the financial wherewithal to hang out here and not be a drain on society and be a contributing member, however we're defining that. And so, unfortunately, with this mass asylum situation and migrant problem, that's not there. And so, I love what you're saying because I think we can solve that problem somehow. But now the optics are just it's along the lines of you're going to drive by like sites and you're like, oh my gosh, they're not from here, and then people are going to have whatever weird feelings they have about that. But I think that you're right. Like people need to get over that. It's interesting. And speaking of homelessness, you in your last newsletter were discussing a framework to think about it, and riffing on Donna Meadows, who has an interesting framework to discuss problems. I'm wondering whether could you share a little bit about that framework and just with regard to homelessness, because it's such a salient thing here in Los Angeles, and you're doing a lot of cool work on a civic level with it, but maybe you can unpack that framework a little bit and how that jives or contrasts with what's going on actually on the ground here.
Yeah. And the Donella Meadows framework is also applicable to what we just discussed, to immigration.
Okay.
Because essentially there's a phenomenal article which is called the 12. If you type in Google, the 12 levers of system change, you'll come across this framework that she came up with. And she wrote some like really interesting books that I'm going to read, but I just came across her recently and through that article. And her framework essentially posits that all of these issues that we're talking about politically are a function or the result of a system. And so in order to deal with them effectively, you have to use the tools of systems thinking in order to come up with ideas. And she came up with this cool framework about what she calls the 12 levers. And essentially it's like this pyramid where at the top you have the least effective ways of dealing with it, and at the bottom you have the most effective. So like, I'll give you an example. Like the least effective way is to change around things like taxes. The most effective way is to change the goal of the system. So if you say like, I'm going to pass a tax law to try to help unhoused Angelenos. Like, okay, there might be some nobility to that kind of policy. But if you go down, what Donella is trying to get people to do is go down to the bottom of that pyramid where it's really high leverage, where you look at the goal. Like, what's the goal? Are we trying to like have a political win, or are we trying to solve the problem of homelessness in America? And so we've been spending for the very long time, like at least 30 or 40 years in this country, we've been spending all of our time at the top of this pyramid in what Donella says are the low leverage points. So we're fighting about rules and taxes, and we're slightly altering the incentive structure. Like even, for example, like Biden's big Inflation Reduction Act or his CHIPS Act, like these are just like incentive changes, right? Like, oh, let's try to get businesses to open up. We'll give them a little money, or we'll give them a tax break. But it doesn't fundamentally address, the problems that resulted in outsourcing, for example. And the same is true on homelessness. We've been messing around with incremental policies to try to alleviate the suffering, the human suffering on the ground. Meanwhile, we haven't made the decision. And the decision is, are we going to solve this? Are we going to save these human beings, or are we just going to let them die? And that's the shift that I'm hoping to see happen in this country, not just on homelessness, but on a lot of different issues that are coming up. It's like, let's go down to the bottom of her pyramid and make some big changes.
Let's take a quick break to hear from our sponsor. This episode of the Nick Halaris Show is brought to you by Metros Capital. If you're an investor looking for direct access to real estate investments, then we'd love to talk with you. Investment opportunities at Metros Capital balance financial returns and community impact. To learn more, contact us at metros.nickhalaris.com. Again, that's metros.nickhalaris.com. Now let's get back to the episode.
Two more things for you. The episode with Mike Green, Darius, and obviously in your outside of profit life, you're in real estate. And you tend to ask a lot of the questions, and then we get to see some of your reflections in the writing. But I'm going to ask you the super broad question of like, what are you seeing out there right now? And where is real estate going? Such a big piece of the economy, and so many things that affect our lives are impacted by real estate. So what are you seeing out there right now? And then let's see what you have with that, and my follow-ups from there.
Yeah, for sure. Look, it's no secret, like real estate is in a very challenging position right now. Like this might be, it's not the worst conditions that you could imagine. It's pretty close. Well, you have high interest rates. You have assets that were at peak valuations going into this. So you have a bunch of room to the downside on every asset class in real estate. And the rates, this interest rate shock of 2022 is wreaking havoc on real estate all across the world, and definitely here in this country. And the industry has been in sort of wait and see mode and trying to hold on for dear life, hoping that rates will start coming down.
Survive till 2025.
Exactly. Like that's been the MO, and maybe that some people are going to be able to survive, but I feel like the early signs of capitulation are happening. Like office ER is already happening. People are just like washing their hands. Like there's no chance of refinancing these projects. There's no hope of releasing them. You can't get a loan at a decent enough rate, so you can't really even use debt in that industry. So it's tough out there. There's no question. Like I'm the most worried that I've ever been. Like I started investing in real estate in 2009, and so I came out. It was after like the turmoil of the crash, and what was different about then, like the fundamental picture was worse then because you had a bunch of unemployed people in this country. So like there was a real economic problem, but rates were low. And if you had the financial wherewithal, you could buy properties that were priced appropriately, and you could make sense of deals. And now we're in this like weird position where like the chart is probably going like that, and no one wants to like buy and just end up 20% down from where they purchased. So everyone is in wait and see mode, and there hasn't been a ton of transactions, but it's got to be going lower from here. I'm not sure how bad it's going to get, but it looks pretty ugly out there.
When you say it going lower, be specific. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, prices for real estate assets.
For sure. But not on residential homes, because that supply demand situation doesn't beget lower prices at the moment, right?
I think so. I think housing is a unique animal because it's such an undersupplied situation in America, and you have this situation where a huge percentage, like 80% of all the houses in America that have mortgages on them have mortgages under 5%.
Yeah.
And so in a world where short-term interest rates are over that, they're going to sell it. So housing is sort of protected by this very unique set of circumstances, but that's not true of other sectors in commercial real estate. Yeah.
Any green shoots, any products, any real estate product types that you're like, that's interesting right now? Or is it like dry powder, sit inside? And that's one of the things you referred to in one of your newsletters, and there's a lot of liquidity sitting on the sides. Anything interesting though?
Yeah. Like on the valuation side, not really. Like I don't see like a real strong bull case to do anything, except for maybe buy these offices. If you had a bunch of cash, like buying some of these offices in San Francisco or New York, maybe that's a good trade right now. But there is a scenario, like I just presented sort of a doomsday scenario, which is that this will look like the great financial crisis, and real estate will be down 40% from peak to trough. It might not happen though. I wrote about this recently in the newsletter, because this is a weird situation. Like there might actually be a soft landing. We're a year into these interest rate hikes, and the labor market is still looking good, and the economy is still holding up. You have all this dry powder, so you don't have the sudden withdrawal of liquidity that happened in the great financial crisis, which was a major contributing factor to why there was such a huge price decline. Is like you just couldn't do anything. Like now there's still people with money on the sidelines, a huge amount, like over 300 billion or something like that. Real estate investors have been trained by this sort of reaction function of the Federal Reserve in the activist era of central banking to expect lower rates. And so they're going to do whatever they can to hold on, because lower rates means valuations will be held up. And so there is some of this reaction function behavior, like, let me hold on, and one day the Fed's going to cut rates and I'll be fine. And there's probably some truth to that strategy. Like we're doing that to an extent on our portfolio, which is just let's batten down the hatches and just operate what we have and see what happens.
Do you think WeWork is cooked?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
It's a wrap.
WeWork is cooked. My other prediction is Sam Bankman-Fried is going to go to jail for a very long time.
It's not looking good for him.
It doesn't look good for him. Every single one of the other executives at FTX is admitting to crimes that will put them in jail as well for years, even though they're a state's witness. Like he's in real trouble. He has no credible defense.
What do you think he's holding out for? Like just the whole intent, issue with some of the things. Like, what do you think he's going through this for? And why didn't he make a deal as well? Like,
plea out? That's a great question. I don't know. Next time I have a prosecutor on the show, I'm going to ask him, because it makes no sense to me. Like the case is so bad for him that
And everything we're hearing gets worse. I don't know.
maybe they didn't offer him a plea that was interesting. Maybe they said, yeah, you can plea for 30 or something. And he was like, I don't want to go to jail for 30 years. So
how deep do you think his parents are in on it? Like Joe Bankman, our professor from law school, and Barbara too.
I know. Circumstantial evidence suggests that they're guilty of some crimes as well. At the very least, receiving misappropriated funds, which is like in the hundreds of millions of dollars or something like that. We're not talking about like 50 grand here and there.
The only comment I'll have is just that on this is that when I read that Joe Bankman made this outsized donation to Stanford with misappropriated capital from FTX, and look, like, who knows what he knew and all that good stuff. It's just what I read in, I think, whatever article. But when I read that he made that donation, it was so fascinating to me because, look, man, they're professors at freaking Stanford, right? They're making bank on, to me, like, they're making dough on obviously tenured, and then they got their book deals. And then, I don't know what that actually looks like from a financial standpoint. It's a nice little life in Palo Alto, and it's the professor's lifestyle. But he still wanted to, it was still important to him to make this outsized donation. And I don't know the intent behind that, but it just seemed interesting from an outsider, like, whoa, he really wanted to be a guy like that on some level. And that lifestyle, he wanted to more. I don't know. That was one of the more interesting takes to me, was like, not takes, but pieces of information. And we'll find out more about it soon, I'm sure. But man, he made that donation, and he didn't, I don't know. He was already a part of, like, a fixture at Stanford to me. So it's so interesting.
No, it's interesting. It shows you the power of money, like that kind of money that quickly. I've never had that experience, so I can't really comment, but I have a feeling that it's incredibly destabilizing psychologically. Yeah,
For sure.
This is why, like, boxers, boxers probably, that's why they struggle financially too. It comes too fast, right? Like, you make 100 million in one night. You're not prepared for that. Where, like, the investor who plods away for 30 years and makes 100 million, they're prepared to deal with the 100 million when they have it, and in a way that's different.
There's a lottery phenomenon, right? Like, the winners, they end up losing, an outside percentage of them end up losing their capital because they're not prepared for it in the same way. Just my last thing was, and I know we're running on time, so it's strike season, it's labor season. You and Darius discussed labor hoarding, and I think there was some really, Jamie Gruber, Dickenhoff, I'm forgetting the name, but a lot of, and then even with Dimitri talking about, like, the distinction between labor and capital, it's strike season. So you're a Detroiter, you got the auto workers strike going on. We're here in Los Angeles. You got stuff going on with the writers. I guess they resolved theirs, and then SAG. What are your thoughts? I mean, did you see all this coming at some point, given where we are with capitalism, or, take me through what you're thinking about as you're watching some of these things unfold?
Yeah, it's a very important dynamic in the economy and in politics, quite frankly, because for the longest time, labor was, like, on its heels, right? Like, they had declining membership, and they had lost the power that they had built, let's say 40 years ago, for example, when the labor unions were incredibly financially powerful. But it's been interesting talking to, like, we had several leadership gurus on the show. We had Anton Gunn, Tyler Dickerhoof, and Jamie Gruber, and all of them, and Adam Hill too, as well, who also we talk mostly about, like, fear, but he also is kind of involved in leadership stuff, and all of them pointed out that there's, like, this problem in America around toxic workplace or unmotivated employees. And to me, I didn't see the strikes coming because I'm just not tied to that world. Like, as a small entrepreneur running a real estate company, I'm not in those kind of conversations that are happening in big corporate organizations. But just after listening to them and looking I'm not surprised that it's happening, and it's probably going to keep happening because, look, the CEOs have been running out of control for 40 years, taking more and more of the resources of these corporations. And everyday workers are not benefiting in the same way. And so this to me makes a lot of sense why they're pissed. And at the same time, not only is it about money, it's also about the environment. And COVID like woke up a lot of people to like how crappy their lives were. So they're like, oh my God, I hate commuting to work. I hate my boss, whatever. Like they had a bunch of people quit, and yeah, like it revealed, I think COVID revealed how bad it was out there, and how sort of not corrupt, but just how unideal it is to be in some of these organizations where leaders are self-oriented and they're not taking care of their teams and whatnot. And people are just fed up. Yeah. So I think this is the beginning, even though it's been like, there's been a bunch, like you mentioned, like there's like 5 or 6 ongoing big consequential. I actually think we're at the beginning of it, and labor is going to take its stand against this accumulation of wealth into the hands of a few.
What I didn't, it actually surprised me, when you got into leadership segmentation of the podcast, I never really, and some of the writings as well, I never really expected there to be so many points extracted that would just go right to like the macro environment with labor. I don't know. I wasn't putting 2 and 2 together like that, but yeah, man, I mean, talking about the desire for autonomy, and maybe that's really what's driving people in a lot of ways outside of money, which is an easy thing to say, oh, I want more money, but really you probably just want, you're seeking something else. And so, and when you see how some of like the leadership in Detroit and the strikes here in Los Angeles, their comp is tied to the stock market. And, you have labor's comp getting tied to just our minimum wage. The disparities are crazy. And so it's just been interesting to watch from my armchair, eating my popcorn, to see what's happening and see where it's going to go. But you think there's going to be more?
Yeah. I think there's going to be more, and especially if we get the sticky inflation scenario, which it looks like this outbreak of conflict in the Middle East makes me really concerned that we have sticky inflation and rates are going to be higher for longer. And you could have a world where you have inflation and job losses at the same time, like in the 70s. And then, people are going to be upset because standard of livings are going to start going down even faster. And so labor is going to try to protect itself.
Yeah. Interesting. Last thing on my mind is you discuss your readings. Give me, like, what are you reading these days? And what should people check out? I know that you were reading the Josh Hawley book, which is, I'm sure, amazing. I kid. But talk to us a little bit about what you've been reading and what's up next. What's in the queue? Yeah.
So the Hawley book was worth reading. If you're interested in masculinity, read it. It's one perspective. It's not a well-written book, but it was worth checking out. You got to have an open mind.
If you're into masculinity, go read that guy's book. Got it.
Yeah. No, but there's a bunch of other ones too. If you want to understand, look, 70-something million people voted for Donald Trump in the last elections. So if you want to understand America, you have to be willing to engage with some of that content to get a sense of what's going on. Of course. Yeah. But as of right now, I'm reading a phenomenal book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which was written in the 70s. And I'm going to be writing an article about it. I'm only like a quarter of the way through it. And essentially, the author is forming. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it, so it's like a legit book. He's forming this argument about how the psychoanalytic movement and the post individuals and thinkers who were involved in psychoanalysis, they basically, not that they all got it wrong, but they didn't emphasize the extent to which a human being's relationship with death is the source of all of our psychology, our positive and our neuroses, our positive ones. And so he's trying to, I can tell from where the book's going is he's trying to tie in these psychological insights from psychoanalysis to another field of thought, which is super interesting, which is mythology and the hero's journey and the extent to which human beings are sort of obsessed with heroism. And I think it's undeniable. Like you can just look at like movie sales, for example, like what we are very interested in the heroic life journey.
In any
And
culture, right?
yeah, the stories around it. And so, yeah, I can't wait to get to the end, and I'll write an article to summarize it, but I can highly recommend
what's the correlation between death and behavior? Like what, or perception of death? Like have you gotten there at all?
Not really, but it's more just understanding the part where I'm at right now is Becker is describing how a child's, it's, contrary to what Freud thought, it's not a child's sexual fantasies that cause its ego to form, but rather the realization that they have a finite body, that they're going to die. And they start to form character traits that they can glom onto, which begin to form the basis of the ego. And
there's so much.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating because basically, if you read all these mystics that I've been writing about in the newsletter over the past 3 or 4 years, the mystics intuited all this before even the psychologists were there, and they talked about how to sort of become a fully enlightened human being, you have to drop all of that stuff and transcend the ego. They have this whole. And he's leading to the same place as my hypothesis, but we'll have to see towards the end of the book.
Okay. I'm looking forward to that. What else are we reading?
I read recently a book called The Best Minds by, I think if I remember right, the author's name is Jonathan Rosen. Really good book about a friendship that he had with someone who had developed schizophrenia. And I won't reveal the plot, but it was a tragic story. And we have a shared friend who had a similar fate, and so it brought back a lot of tough memories. But it's a very well written book, and it explains, taking it back to the conversation we had earlier about homelessness. It explains how we got to the legal status quo that we have now, where it's very difficult for the state to intervene upon an individual's rights, even when that individual is engaging in behavior that is like obviously against his or her self-interest. And so I sort of knew that history, but I never got all the cases. Like the author actually goes through the case law. And essentially, like the story is, before the sort of awakening of the 60s and 70s around mental health, we had a pretty barbaric system in place that allowed for very inhumane treatment of people with mental health issues, and women in particular were being sort of forced hospitalized by husbands that didn't like the way that, it was out of control. But the author makes a case that we just went too far in the other direction. So now the government can't do anything. You could be injecting yourself with fentanyl on the street, and the government, it's hard for them to do something to stop it. And I feel like our generation, again, is going to come back to us. We're going to have to bring that more in the middle. We don't want to go back to the old asylum days, but we can't allow people to kill themselves on the street. We got to have the courage to say, you know what, we're not going to let that happen, and we're going to do something.
You didn't check out Elon Musk's autobiography, the Walter Isaacson?
No, I have some friends reading it. Are you reading it?
No, I'm not. And it's so interesting, man. It's like one of those things with like bad social media. You don't want to give it that click, but you're curious. And I want to see, because like someone said something. I saw like a maybe it was a tweet, and someone was like, in the very first, maybe he was even in the jacket, he was bullied as a kid or something like that. And I'm like, oh my God, that's enlightening. And there's just so many little nuggets that would be fascinating. But tip my cap to the guy, of course. But like, there's some quirks in there that I'm like, I don't know if I want to give it my $20 or whatever it is. But I do get, that's my form of activism, right? Like, I don't know if I need to.
It might be worth reading. Like, have you seen the scandal around Michael Lewis's new book?
Yeah, I have. And it is weird because there were a bunch of articles, Slate article, Atlantic, everyone was teeing off, New York Times, etc. And at that point, I had to pour out a little bit of liquor. RIP to one of my favorites. Michael Lewis was the man. I mean, Liar's Poker, Big Short, all that stuff. And then it seems like there's some puffery going on here, and I haven't read it, but is that something you're going to check out? The SBL, I forget what it's called, but
I don't think I'm going to read it, but the backstory for listeners is he was like embedded with Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, and he published this book, which is sort of
lived with him, like he followed him around for like 6 months, something.
Yeah,
like that,
same
right?
thing that Isaacson did with Musk.
With Musk, yeah,
to produce that one, and he's an apologist for him, and he didn't catch the fact that Sam Bankman-Fried was running the greatest fraud in modern history. Like he missed that. He missed that.
Maybe he's right. I don't know. We don't quite know yet, but yeah, he's an apologist. But it really was like this deification of him in a lot of ways that regardless of how this all shakes out, I was like, really? Oh no, that was cringy.
Yeah, and you got to wonder, like the publishers they had to have known that like that narrative wasn't going to play. They could have just rewritten a section of the book or something. Doesn't make any sense.
Right.
I'm actually surprised it got released the way it's written, but
you know what? And then the next thing was like The Blind Side. Now I'm hearing all that controversy. I don't know how familiar you are with that. You know, Michael Orr saying, you know, the Tui, the family that adopted him, or did they adopt him? Like they're now, you know, not acting as kind to him as he was portrayed, and they thought he was this dumb oaf and all that good stuff. And Michael Lewis was a part of the whole, you know, the narrative of it all. And I'm like, oh man, Michael, you're my guy.
Yeah. You know what we'll do is I'll have John Berg come back on the show and ask him how it is that how the Hollywood system creates for conditions where these stories get told that may or not be true.
Yeah.
That's
so interesting.
Perspective. Yeah. Well, dude, thank you for,
we could keep going. You know, I got topics for days, man, but I know people got things to do with themselves.
Exactly. Well, I appreciate you.
I'm glad you're wearing the same color though.
I know. We didn't even plan it. Thanks for doing this, and it was fun talking, and I'll see you on the tennis court.
Yeah, I'll catch you there. I'll catch you there. All right, man.
All right, thanks, man.
Thank you for listening to the Nick Halaris Show. We hope you enjoyed the episode and would appreciate your help with spreading the word by sharing with your network on social. And until next time, remember, it's not about pursuing success to unlock fulfillment. It's about learning how to find fulfillment in the midst of success.